Okay, so this one is going to be extra rambling just for you. Um, it's going to be about crafting a specific monster to kind of maybe challenge is the wrong word, but provide an interesting fight, however you want to word it, for a particular party. And first, I'm going to lay out who the party is and kind of go over some of their strengths and weaknesses and stuff. I talked about this group in my last video. It's from my Curse Strahd game. It's my character, the Asimar Zealot Barbarian. Got lots of magic right now. He's got a belt of fire giant strength. We all the tough feet now, all sorts of stuff. So he does the highest average damage in the party, roughly. Not factoring in spells and other shit. But just general, like in a normal fight where he has access to resources, he's just going to pop rage and then that's it. He's got the highest average damage in the party. I don't have access to all the other players' character sheets, so I can't be 100% sure on that, but yeah. He's got the highest damage and the highest survivability of the party. His main weakness is that he's a melee dude. But other strengths, he's got resistance to standard physical damage types, being a barbarian. So he's got that, and as an Asimar, he's got resistance to necrotic and radiant. So that's something to harp on. A little dusty at work today. So there's that. Not a whole lot extra to note there, other than just he has really high damage and he utilizes mainly slashing, necrotic, and radiant damage himself. So he uses 3 different damage types. That might be a quirk that we can dig into when designing a monster. Next we have, and I'm kind of going over my familiarity with what these characters do. We've got Etzli, who is a Hexblade Warlock who has illusionist bracers, so this character's average damage is also very high. Senlir the Barbarian, his average damage is in the 50s. Etzli's average damage is in the 40s if everything hits. And, that's a caveat. I usually like to do my math not worrying about if everything hits, because I don't do my math with a target monster in mind. A target AC in mind, I should say. But it should be worth noting that Etzli has a lower to hit bonus than Senlir does, so that's a factor. Otherwise, standard Hexblade Warlock stuff, in addition to having a Flame Tongue longsword. So their average damage is high, 4 Eldritch Blasts per turn, variety of spells, they have invisibility, some other things they can use. Otherwise, standard Warlock options. Nothing too crazy there, other than just versatility. Next up, you've got, I'm going to say Unta next, who's just the Goblin Druid. Lots of healing, limited damage options, but they have some good control options with things like Spike Growth and Entangle, spells like that. Just a really solid, I don't know what circle. I would say, whichever one has the totems. Is that Shepherd Druid? That's the one that Unta is. He's got the totems. So, that's a thing. Next up, you've got the Wanderer, who is a Death Cleric. So, kind of more focused on damage options. A lot of necrotic damage sources. So, that's a wrinkle. We've got a definite 2 sources of necrotic damage. So, that's a factor. Then, We got, what do you call it? Then we have the new character, Fuse. And the Wanderer is a cleric. They have support options too. Fuse, the artillerist artificer. Booms. Lots of specialty ranged attacks. They have a crossbow. They have the force ballista. All that kind of stuff. I don't think that character has any like special magic items right now. I haven't seen anything. But just really solid, consistent ranged damage. So that's a thing. So, what are some of the qualities about this party? I went into it in the previous video. They're very versatile. Every character covers a different kind of role and covers it well. You've got the frontliner and main damage dealer in Senlir. You've got the versatile damage dealer and utility in Etzli. You've got another versatile damage dealer and support in the Wanderer. You've got a ranged damage dealer, a ranged specialist damage dealer in Fuse, and you've got the healer role in Uta. So their bases are pretty well covered. The main thing they're not good at is area of effect damage. But of course, these characters can put out so much single target damage that maybe that's not as big of a deal, and they can just kill single targets really quick. But that is a factor. Nobody can throw out a fireball and hit 7 dudes at once and wipe them all off the board instantly. So that's a factor, and should go into planning. So, otherwise, some of our main damage types. We've got a few points of slashing damage, 1 point of piercing damage if Wanderer wants to use his rapier, which at this point he's probably not really going to. Probably not really going to use his rapier all that much. We've got several points of necrotic damage. Several. In Wanderer and Senlir, some of their main damage is going to be necrotic, whether it's spells like Inflict Wounds or the extra damage from Senlir's weapon. We've got one point of radiant damage, and it's not a lot of radiant damage, but it is some, and that is enough to trigger some features on monsters sometimes. Things like, if a monster has regeneration, but if they take radiant damage, then the regeneration doesn't function. Stuff like that. We've got a little bit of fire damage and force damage from Etzli, and they're they have the Flame Tongue Longsword that does direct fire damage, and they have the Green Flame Blade cantrip, so nice fire damage there, and the force damage from Eldritch Blast, so some varied damage types from that character. You've also got force damage from Fuse and the Force Ballista, as well as piercing damage from their crossbow. So, relatively varied damage types, nothing crazy. Or, maybe it is a little crazy. But, so, after finally getting through 8 minutes of that, 9 minutes almost, let's see. How do we want to challenge this party? Well, the first way you can do it is to kind of go up against their strengths and eliminate their strengths. Things like, let's say there's just a big boss that just has so much AC and so much health that Senlir is still going to just have trouble damaging it. And maybe you specifically, you can specifically kind of eliminate a character's strengths, which never feels good. And if you're going to do that, there needs to be a vulnerability somewhere. So maybe this is a monster that is built for melee combat. Its melee combat is incredible. It gets like 5 attacks per round, and it does really intense damage per attack for something that has 5 attacks. let's say it's something like that. So let's say, and because I'm such a big fan of body horror, let's say that this is a monster that is an amalgamation golem, flesh golem, made of several ogres and elves, and there's a dwarf or two thrown in for good measure, something like that. Some sort of horrible, twisted mound of vaguely humanoid giant mound of flesh and arms and teeth and faces, something like that. Yeah. So this monster has effectively, let's say, and there's a lot of different ways you can go about giving this monster insane survivability. Let's say it has resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, slashing damage from melee attacks, not from non-magical weapons, just from melee attacks. So you're going to have a harder time fighting it in melee. That said, the main melee character is only getting roughly 40% of his damage in slashing, because he's doing 6.5 plus 10 slashing damage per attack, and then he's doing 7 necrotic and an average of 7 radiant. So yeah, like roughly 40-ish% don't matter. So that's a factor, but that's not a huge factor. So let's say, instead of wording it that way, it just has resistance to damage from melee attacks. So as long as you're performing a melee attack on it, whatever damage type it is, it just resists it. It's just very capable at deflecting damage from melee attacks. So, you can work that into the flavor. I'm not super worried about that at the moment. So, you're going to have a harder time. You do half damage with melee attacks. That damages Senlir a lot. But Senlir's not exactly the type of character that can just stay back and throw javelins. That's not going to help all that much. Especially when you consider the next property that this monster is going to have. It's going to have, say, a bonus action. Well, first, it's going to have, like I said, 5 attacks and really big damage. This will be damage that Senlir can deal with, but he's not going to be as offensively effective. So for this particular fight, he's going to be more regulated to a kind of frontline tanking role. He's already doing that, but he's going to be more, maybe putting in more work that way, because he's going to be doing less damage proportionately. Everyone else is going to be doing full damage, but he's going to be doing half. But he's still going to be tanking in the same way. So he's going to be able to absorb damage the same way. And this monster doesn't necessarily ignore some of the other properties that Senlir has with his slasher feat, reduced movement speed, and the sentinel feat that he also has. So, something like that. Senlir has to leverage his survivability to take all these attacks. But this monster also, say, has a recharging jump attack, where it can jump, 60 feet, something like that. Yeah, sure, 60 feet. Well, some kind of feet. Maybe the rest of the party can stand far enough away that it's kind of not going to matter, because they're going to have 120 foot range on certain attacks. So let's say 60 feet, and this jump attack, let's say it's a recharge ability. So what it does is you can jump 60 feet, and then everything in the area where you land, from maybe 15, 20, 30 feet out from that point, has to make a saving throw or take damage and get knocked around. Something like that. that allows this monster to target and jump to the ranged members of the group, like basically everyone that is in Senlir. So what this will do is create a dynamic where the rest of the party is going to stand back, and Senlir is going to get in close with this monster and fight it. But then, every time this jump ability recharges, it might break off from Senlir. And when it does so, it will, it'll just run away from Senlir, move away, and then try to jump at one of the enemies, at one of the other members of the party, to deal damage to them, knock them prone, and make it harder for them to get away. And what's more, so then that next turn, jump, if they fail to save, they get knocked prone and take some damage. Then they have to spend their movement to get up, and they're going to have a harder time getting away from this monster because they have half movement, so it'll have an easier time closing in on them and beating the shit out of them with its 17 arms. And then Senlir will then have to catch up. So this will create a dynamic where the party has to basically kill it before it gets too many turns of this. Maybe, and if they have enough resources to start off, it won't be super hard, but maybe there's some other things involved. But this will be the kind of dynamic going on here. But the thing about this dynamic is once you figure it out, there's not a whole lot of nuance or choice being made other than exactly how you deal with it. It's just, okay, the monster recharges, so it's going to run away and attack somebody else, and then Senlir has to close in. Maybe they can make choices like, say, on that first time that this monster does this, it goes after Etzli, and Etzli takes like a quarter of their life just from the jump attack, and then they take a few hits on the next turn, so they're down to below half their life. So now Etzli gets as far away as possible, and Wanderer kind of stays a little closer to be that more valuable secondary target, something like that. While Senlir is trying to catch up and regain the monster's attention. But there's one factor I'm missing here. Senlir has these movement control feats like Slasher and Sentinel. So this troll ogre abomination can't just walk away from Senlir, use the dash action to get within 60 feet of another target, and then jump at them. Because if it tries that, it'll just get its speed reduced to 0. So, well, how do you overcome that? Good question. Maybe there's no real way to overcome that without directly just giving it some feature that negates Sentinel or the Slasher feat. Which, giving it features that negate things that your party does, not the best feeling thing in the world, but maybe that's not the point. Sometimes you do have to do stuff that makes the party feel bad, in a way, because not everything's going to be fair. Maybe this thing just isn't fair. It can just ignore the Sentinel feed because fuck you. Or maybe instead, you have some feature that lets it ignore the movement restriction or movement elimination of Sentinel, but imposes some other detriment upon it. Like the next attack roll it makes has disadvantage, something like that. It takes some kind of detriment so that you can, play around that really strong denial feature that a character has, but you still give them some kind of benefit for having that feature in the first place. So that can be an okay kind of dynamic, a monster that does this. It's a more dynamic fight, because you're hinging on whether this bonus action jump attack is going to recharge, and then it causes this semi-frantic struggle to reposition the entire party, and your main tank has to then close in after it. Maybe he's going to have to spend his action to dash, all sorts of stuff. So there could be. There's, that's a. Thinking about it, that's a relatively simple monster. Relatively. So maybe there's some other. There's always different ways to change a party like this. Maybe instead, there's a monster that is some sort of mirror spirit. It's made of mirror energy. I don't know what that is. Who cares? It's from the mirror dimension, where it's get out of here. So, the way this monster works is, the monster has its own hit points that never change. Something like that. But, every time it gets hit, like let's say every time a party member either, we could just say does damage to it, or forces it to make a saving throw, every time a party member interacts with this monster, it then shapeshifts to gain the abilities of that party member. So, and then let's say it has 2 legendary actions or something. Only 2. Why 2? I don't know. So that its turn is the big threat. So, the way this monster would work is they would figure this out. Like every time they hit it, it changes. And probably that first round, they would just go through their initiative order and they'd all do stuff to the monster that would keep changing shape and gaining the player's abilities and stats except for HP. And maybe some other things like AC and some other stuff. But it would gain their offensive abilities. So then the party starts to plan. Like, their turn, the monster's first turn comes around, and let's say Sanlier was the last one to hit it. Its initiative is right, or Sanlier's initiative is right before the monster's. So let's say it's, it's in Sanlier's shape. It goes into a rage, and it goes after Etzli, does that 50 average damage I talked about, and that's almost enough to kill Etzli in one shot, because Etzli has like 60-something health right now. Not good, man. And then let's say if it shapeshifts again, it loses properties, so it wouldn't just keep rage forever now. But, so then, okay, that next turn they're like, we have to space our attacks and formulate our strategy so that it's not Sanlier next turn. But who do we want it to be? If we make it Etzli, it could shoot any of us. This is a fun way to turn a party's strengths in on themselves by literally using their strengths against them. So then that next round, the party would probably be trying to figure out, who should we make it? Who should it be? And maybe they make it Unta that next round. Like, everybody readies an action, readies their turn to go, or readies an action to do a thing after Sanlier acts, let's say. So Sanlier does his stuff, and then everybody else goes, and Unta specifically worded their readied action after everyone else makes an action, takes action, whatever. So then it becomes Unta, and then that turn it heals itself, I guess, or does something Unta-ish. But that's more of an example of, you're technically challenging the player's strengths, but that's more of a mental strategy kind of thing. How do we approach this fucking thing? So those are just a bunch of spitbally ideas. But there's other ways to challenge them. There's always ways to challenge a party like this. I could definitely, if this wasn't a video format, I could definitely come up with a monster that challenges them in a lot more specific ways. But in a video, you're kind of going off the cuff. But that's kind of the point. So this was a fun video. I hope you enjoyed it.